In a forgotten village, hidden between dry hills and a dying river, lived a man the world had already forgotten. His name was Kojo. Kojo was a farmer who had lost everything. A farmer who had nothing left, absolutely nothing but his memories. There was a time when his land was green, when laughter filled his home, when he had bumper harvest, when life was kind. But then the drought came and the sky stopped listening. But still, every morning he returned to the land, not because he had hope, but because he had nothing else. So one fateful evening, Kojo, feeling very tired and broken, sat beneath the only tree that still remembered him, a baobab tree on his land. Then he heard it, a voice calling his name. Kojo, 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 Kojo. At first, he thought it was the wind, until the wind spoke back. Kojo. From the shadows, there came not men, not spirits, but something far older. They were dwarfs. The farmer stepped back in fear as the dwarfs faced him, one stepping forward with glowing eyes and intense eye contact. Kojo's heart began to race because deep inside he knew that this was no ordinary night. Then the shortest among the dwarfs spoke to him. Kojo, why do you cry on a land that is not truly empty? What did they mean? The mystery unfolds in part 2. A group of mystical African dwarf spirits slowly circling a frightened farmer at night under a massive baobab tree with their eyes faintly glowing. They did not attack him. They did not run. They only circled him. At this point, Kojo could not move. His body froze, but his heart pounded like a drum in the night. The smallest dwarf stepped forward from the group, glowing eyes calm but intense. Your land is not dead, so why do you treat it like a grave? He asked. Kojo, speaking with frustration and pain, gestured towards his dry land. Kojo's voice trembled. 3 years. Nothing has grown here. This land is finished. The tallest dwarf stepped forward. With a more intimidating presence, he said, No, it is not finished. It was taken. Together, the dwarfs echoed, by greed. Taken by greed. At this point, Kojo looked confused and shaken, slowly stepping back with uncertainty on his face. Kojo's mind raced. Greed? Whose greed? Then, the smallest dwarf stepped forward. Extending his hand slightly, faint glow surrounding him. The others watched silently. He said, We can help you. For the first time in years, hope touched Kojo's heart. But hope does not come freely. The smallest dwarf leaned closer to Kojo with intense glowing eyes and said to him, On the 7th night, when your land lives again, you will give us what you love the most. What he loved the most? His daughter, Abena. Back at his hut, Kojo stood outside and held his head in distress. His daughter, his only light in the world of darkness, and now they wanted her? That night, Kojo faced the choice no man should ever make: love or survival. What would you choose? Part 3 is where everything changes. Watch out for part 3. Kojo did not sleep that night. He sat outside his mud house all night, head in his hands, lost in thoughts. The voices of the dwarfs echoed in his mind, and so did the laughter of his daughter. By morning, Kojo made his choice, not because he was heartless, but because hunger had already taken too much. I accept. The words left his mouth, but his heart refused them. Without a word, the dwarfs gave him a small clay pot filled with something that did not belong to this world. Spread it before sunrise, the dwarfs instructed. And so, before the sun could rise, Kojo did exactly as he was told. At first, nothing happened. Then, the earth began to breathe. By afternoon, green covered the land. By evening, life had returned. The land was all green and fertile again. By daybreak, people traveled from everywhere to Kojo's farm. They couldn't believe their eyes. How could this happen overnight? They asked themselves. They called it a miracle. In no time, the news quickly traveled far and near, and people kept trooping into Kojo's farm to witness this miracle for themselves. But Kojo could not celebrate. Kojo sat quietly, watching his daughter play happily in the sunlight. His face was filled with sadness and guilt, because every passing day was bringing him closer to the seventh night. And every time he looked at his daughter, his heart broke a little more. The seventh night is coming. Part 4 will break you. Watch out. The seventh night finally arrives. It did not arrive with noise. It arrived with silence. The wind stopped. All insects disappeared. Even the night was watching. Inside the hut, his daughter Abena slept, unaware that her world was about to change. Kojo sat beside his sleeping daughter. He watched her as she slept, and for the first time, he hated himself. Kojo held his head tightly and shut his eyes in deep emotional pain. He said, "I cannot do this. I won't do this. She is my child." Then it came, a knock on the door. A group of dwarf spirits stood outside the hut in darkness, with glowing eyes piercing through the night. They called, "Kojo, it is time." Kojo stepped out of his hut slowly, closing the door behind him, his face filled with pain. His legs felt heavy, but his heart was heavier. Kojo stood face to face with the dwarfs. They stood before him, waiting. Kojo stood firmly, his eyes filled with tears but determination. The dwarfs in front of him, he said, "No, I will not give her to you." The dwarf's eyes started glowing brighter, wind swirling dust around them, ground slightly cracking with intense supernatural energy. They said, "You made a promise." The ground started shaking beneath Kojo's feet, dust rising and cracks forming. The earth began to tremble. Kojo started to shout emotionally. With visible tears on his face, he stood his ground despite the fear. He said, "Take the land, take everything, but not my child." The dwarfs suddenly stood still, with their glowing fading slightly and atmosphere calm again. Then everything stopped. And for the first time, something changed. Kojo stood there breathing heavily and waiting with uncertainty, not knowing if he had just saved his daughter or he had lost everything. Did Kojo just break the deal? Stay tuned as the story unfolds in the final part. Watch out for part 5. Kojo stood still in the dark night, breathing heavily, tensions in the air fading, dust settling around him. The ground stopped shaking, and the wind returned. Kojo's eyes were filled with fear and uncertainty, with sweat and tears very visible. Kojo closed his eyes, waiting for something to be taken from him. Instead of taking something from Kojo, the smallest dwarf stepped forward, calmly, glowing softly, with no anger in his expressions, but peaceful and powerful presence. He said to Kojo, "You have passed." Kojo opened his eyes slowly in confusion, his eyebrows furrowed. Wearing an unsure expression, he asked, "Passed?" The dwarfs stood calmly together, their glow now soft and peaceful, no longer threatening. With mystical calm atmosphere, they said, "We were never here to take your child. We were here to test your heart. This land was cursed long before you. Its blessing was stolen by greed." The smallest dwarf pointed gently towards Kojo's chest, in other words, his heart, and they continued. "It could only be restored by a man who would choose love over everything else." At this point, Kojo dropped down to his knees in relief and emotion. Tears flew down freely. He was overwhelmed, not in fear. The dwarves began to fade into glowing particles, dissolving into the night air. They told Kojo, "Your land will remain blessed. But never forget that true wealth is not what grows in the soil, but what lives in your heart." By morning, the dwarves were gone, but Kojo had everything. He hugged his daughter tightly in the early morning sunlight in his green farm. And from that day on, his land flourished, but more importantly, so did his heart. Because sometimes life gives you everything you've prayed for, just to see if you're willing to lose what truly matters. This marks the end of our story. Thank you so much for watching. Please subscribe to Keelah's Tales for more African stories.